Hello, welcome to Exotic Gardening with me, Yorkshire Kris. In this week's episode, we're going to talk about the most important thing if you want to grow an exotic garden, and that is the soil. So in my last video, we looked at what I actually spent in my garden last year, and the top thing that I spent the most money on wasn't plants or seeds or furniture, it was the soil and compost. And I'll do a link to that video below. So why did I spend so much money on the soil and compost? Well, it's the most important thing to make sure you have a fantastic exotic garden, whether you want lush leaves, the jungle look, or the arid look with lots of spiky desert plants. So we're going to look at these various different soil conditions and how they're important to growing exotic plants and what you can do to improve your chances of being able to grow these plants in your garden. So all of us have soil in our gardens, or pretty much all of us. If you're on a balcony, maybe not, but you'll have pots with compost in them. But my point is, whatever your garden soil, you can improve it to either be more free draining for plants that like that, or to actually add that organic matter and make it sort of more moisture retentive for plants that really want the moisture year round. And we change the soil conditions depending on the plants we want to grow. And we've got 2 or 3 distinct areas in my garden where I've really changed the soil conditions to make sure the plants that I choose to grow in those areas can thrive. And those areas are the arid area where I've added lots of grit, and then we've got the jungle exotic area where I've added more organic material and have really bulked out the structure there. But in both these areas, what I've done, the key thing I've done is add winter drainage by raising the actual level of the soil. Even in the arid areas, we've done that for the extra drainage all year round. And in the other areas, we've done that to make sure we've got more nutritious soil at a greater depth for the plants to really get their best in summer and also don't drown in winter. So let's look at what I've done in my arid part of the garden to grow these wonderful plants like this Yucca linearis in front of me. We've got Rostrata behind me, we've got agaves, we've got cacti, we've got palm trees that like desert conditions as well. All these arid loving plants, yes, they need full sunshine, something I'm struggling with at the moment as I look into the camera, but they need that drainage. So what I did when I moved into this garden 12 years ago now was I added tons and tons and tons of grit to the soil. I dug over the lawn, I cultivated this area, added some gritty compost and soil, but then most of it was grit, pure basalt grit, and also general grit that you get from builders' yards as well. I washed well to get out all the salt, and I put a layer over here about 30 centimeters deep. So that is pure grit, then I planted into it. And it means that all these plants that do not like standing in water in winter can really get their roots through that grit, find where they need some nutrition and anchor into the ground, and then get their roots further down into the proper soil underneath where they can get more nutrients and water in summer, but it means that they're not going to be sat in water over winter. So they truly are in a really good free draining mix. So I added grit, I bought grit, and that's what I continue to do if I'm extending the arid planting. And if I plant anything in this area, all I need to do is make a hole obviously to plant into, and then I will take off any sort of growing medium that my arid plants have been potted in, because it's normally compost or even peat, just for its ease of transport from the producers. But I take that off, I plant the plants into the pure grit, potentially into the soil below if it's a big plant, and then I do nothing. I leave it and I let them get their roots in, establish. Might need to water it the first year, but after that they will get more than enough moisture from the UK weather, and they will do really well providing they keep that good drainage. And over the years what will happen is detritus, things will blow in, soil will accumulate slowly into the grit, but by topping up that grit and just making sure that the soil isn't watered too much, especially obviously in winter, then the plants will thrive. This yucca is a prime example. It's not been protected. It's in full sun, as you can see, and it's in that grit, and that drainage just allows the plants to get through the worst winters, because we've had wet winters, and plants like this really do struggle with spotting on the leaves and going chloritic if it gets really bad, wet, cold winters year after year. But this has survived 3 or 4 very wet winters and looking really good, and that is because of that preparation, spending that money on the grit, raising those levels. Yes, it's expensive in the first place, and I've not done it in just little pockets, I've done it over a wide area here, but it really means it gives the best chance for these plants to establish and thrive in my UK pretty mild but damp climate. So here we are at the other end of the garden, where adding to the soil is just as important as the arid part of the garden where we added the grit. But instead of adding the grit here, I added lots and lots of topsoil, lots of good, nutritious, loamy topsoil, so that the thickness of the growing media in this area is much deeper, because I was on heavy clay and I didn't have much sort of soil to work with before it went into pure modelling clay. Now you might not be on clay, you might be on sand, you might be on chalk, you might have a beautiful loamy soil, but whatever conditions you've got, you can improve that by adding more quality topsoil. And the other big thing is adding organic material. And in terms of what I like to add, it is basically farmyard manure, well rotted, not straight from the farm, but well rotted, or spent mushroom compost, which is basically farmyard manure, straw that's been grown, well, mushrooms grown in that for one season, and then spent compost is bagged up and then you can use it in the garden. It does have the drawback of being slightly alkaline, but overall it's fantastic for adding that moisture and goodness into the ground. And I've done this again on a big scale, not just little bits where I've planted plants, not just in pockets, but I've completely covered this area, added probably about good 20, 25, maybe 30 centimeters of depth of soil in this garden on this part, and that's really improved the soil. It's allowed the roots of the plants to really have somewhere to go, pick up those nutrients and provide better, bigger, luscious growth in summer. And even the hardy plants that look good all year round, like the scheffleras, the palm trees here behind me, that are in, we're in winter now, it's still early February, and it's still looking great here because it's got that nutrition. In summer, you've got the big leaves of the gunneras, the gingers, the dahlias, etc., looking beautiful, and I hardly have to feed anything because the soil is doing well. And I did that big obviously effort of adding all that nutrition, adding the depth to the soil a few years ago when I changed this from a lawn to this raised bed with a path going through it. But every year or every other year since, I've added tons of spent mushroom compost and manure. And that has several benefits. It suppresses the weeds, especially if you do it at the back end of winter into early spring, when those annual weeds are trying to come through, when soil temperatures are above sort of 7-8 degrees. And it also means that it makes it look nice and tidy because you've got a nice layer of mulch over it. And it just gives that nutrition, slowly feeding the ground and keeping that moisture in after the winter wet weather. Having the mulch on now means that we'll get beautiful soil underneath that's nice and moist, so even when we have a dry spell underneath, it should still remain moist without having to water the garden too much. Obviously, some plants like the gunneras really do want that added moisture, so you might want to water them more, but generally speaking, mulching year after year slowly incorporates nutrition, improves the soil structure, and is basically, it's a no-dig method, which you might have seen from vegetable growers. And the sort of plants that you grow in a vegetable garden, the big leafy greens, the squashes, the cucumbers, love that nutrition, love that manure in the garden because it allows them to get big leaves and big fruits. And that's the same for the annual tropical plants that I grow here and the big leafed plants that come back year after year. So that is why I continue to add mulch onto the garden. In autumn, the breakdown of the leaves protect the tender plants, but then adding that compost, adding that manure every single sort of winter into spring really means that I get a fantastic growth of my luscious leaf plants and flowers throughout the following season. So in terms of winter or early spring mulch, got my spent mushroom compost here, just a little pile here, but I'm going to spread that over the area. And like I said, it will suppress the weeds, but ideally try to dig up the weeds like that bramble there. So that one's out of the way, and just spread it about. And you want to get a good depth onto the soil. So we're talking, what, maybe 5-10 centimeters, something like that. So you don't want to spread it too thinly. So I'll need plenty and plenty of the spent mushroom compost to cover all this area. But as you can see, it leaves it nice and neat. It's nice and moisture retentive. And then over the next few months, the weather and the worms, the microbes will break down some of this compost, bring it physically into the soil to improve that structure, and it will give it a fantastic head start for when the cannas, the gingers come out of the ground in spring, and then they will flourish in this area because they've got the added nutrition, and they will hardly have to feed anything at all throughout the year. Hopefully, by watching this video, you've seen how improving the soil structure, improving the drainage by adding either grit, compost or soil to your garden can really energize and give that extra oomph to allow you to grow exotic plants, be it arid style desert plants with the gritty areas, or the lush tropical jungle foliage plants in the more moisture retentive, nutritious areas where we've added that compost and manure. And by changing the soil, you can grow a wide range of plants, possibly plants that you thought were not possible in your location, simply by changing the soil. And this is why it's the most important thing you can do to grow an exotic garden, is getting the soil right, and then growing the plants is pretty easy. Thank you for watching this edition of Exotic Gardening UK. Join me next week, where I'll be doing more in the garden.